Let's talk about Crude Capitalism by Adam Hanea. I'm going to give a little overview of the first 3 chapters. Well, first I can actually talk about Hanea himself. Adam Hanea is a development studies academic in the United Kingdom. He's a professor of political economy and global development at the University of Exeter and joint chair in Middle East studies at Tsinghua University. He was formerly professor in development studies at SOAS, University of London, a founding member of the SOAS Center for Palestine Studies, and a former member of the Council for British Research in the Levant. Noted for his research on Marxism, the political economy of the Middle East, labor migration, class and state formation in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Palestine Studies. From 1997 to 2003, lived in the Palestinian territories, where he completed an MA in Regional Studies at Al-Quds University, has a PhD in Political Science from York University in Canada, and previously taught at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates before joining SOAS in London. So Crude Capitalism, just reading from the Verso books description here, how oil greases the wheels of global capitalism. This expansive history traces the hidden connections between oil and capitalism from the late 1800s to the current climate crisis. Beyond simplistic narratives that frame oil as a prize or curse, Crude Capitalism uncovers the surprising ways that oil is woven into the fabric of our modern world. The rise of an American-centered global order, the breakdown of empire and anti-colonial rebellion, contemporary finance and U.S. dollar hegemony, debt and militarism, and the emergence of new forms of synthetic consumption. Much more than an energy source or transport fuel, oil has a foundational place in all aspects of contemporary life. No challenge to the fossil fuel industry can be effective without taking this fact seriously. Crude Capitalism maps the varied geographies of oil, including the rise of OPEC, the importance of revolutionary and post-Soviet Russia, the crucial role of African upstream reserves, and the new petrochemical circuits that link the Middle East, China, and East Asia. The book provides an original and fine-grained empirical analysis of corporate ownership and control, including refining and petrochemicals. By exposing these structures of power and placing oil in capitalism, the book makes an essential contribution to debates around oil dependency and the struggle for climate justice. This is just the first 3 chapters. The first chapter is Approaching Oil. Chapter 2 is the rise of the U.S. oil industry, and Chapter 3 is the Middle East and the Seven Sisters. So I'm just going over my notes from Chapter 1 here. I think the first thing that stuck out to me here is talking about these hockey stick graphs around oil consumption and the way this, a hockey stick graph shoots up like this in the post-war period. So sometimes we think about usage of fossil fuels and we think about the Industrial Revolution, and it's not just the Industrial Revolution. There's this specific moment where the use of fossil fuels, and specifically oil, and carbon emissions at the same time both just shoot up in an almost vertical line, which takes place in this post-war period. Here's a quote which says, "The problem with most conventional writing about oil is that the historical uniqueness of capitalism as a social system is ignored. In fact, capitalism rarely makes an appearance. The result is to naturalize the social system we live under." So when we talk about our dependency on this substance, and we don't talk about the way that's directly tied into the economic model of capitalism. And sometimes we have this idea about the way we live right now, and especially about capitalism and people that are immersed living in a capitalist society. And every time you try and make a suggestion about maybe perhaps organizing your society or economy in another way, and they say the same 3 words. They say, it's human nature, right? It's not just a Michael Jackson song. But that's what people believe, because you've grown up in this system, you were born in it, you get old in it, and you die in it, and you believe it's just as natural as gravity. It's as natural as any of these kind of like natural forces that govern our lives. It's human nature. But it's not. It's directly tied to this economic model and specific economic decisions that have been made by very, very powerful people over the years to create this exact set of circumstances. So that's the first point, is that the use of oil and these fossil fuels is directly tied into our economic model. Yet we live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Quote from Ursula K. Le Guin. I think that's a really wonderful quote and something to think about that gives us hope and optimism for the future. But as something that will continue coming up, I think, in this discussion is the way of like moving away from fossil fuels and oil in particular. We'll see through like climate crisis and the various ways this has this really destructive and corrosive effect on our society is something that's necessary to do. But because the way our society and our economy has been organized is profoundly difficult, if not impossible. And that leads to another quote here that I wanted to look at, where Hania says, we will consider, for instance, oil's transformation into petrochemicals and plastics, a material substrate that now underlies all aspects of commodity production and consumption. So again, we think about this, we think about our addiction to oil and fossil fuels and, carbon emissions, and we think about the substance and like what's going into our gas tank, or what's powering our electricity, or all these modern comforts that we have in these developed societies. And we think, okay, well, we just need to change to a different form of sustainable energy, and then things will start to get better. But we lose sight of all of the ways that oil is absolutely just pervasive in absolutely everything, everywhere in our entire society. It's in paint, it's in all plastics, it's in everything. It's in asphalt, as we talk about in this book. It's in the literal, the asphalt that we use to pave the roads. So we can switch to a different form of transportation that doesn't rely on oil and gas as far as powering the actual engine, but it's still extremely inescapable. And even if you look at an EV, and this is something that's going to be explored later, so we don't need to get too much into it now, but if you take a look at an EV, and I agree, yeah, it's going to be better for everyone to drive EVs instead of oil and gas powered cars. Yes, I think we can probably agree on that. But if you look at what the components of an EV, all the plastics, all the paint, it's in the tires, it's in everything. Everything is made of oil. And the whole process, again, as we'll get into this more later, but the whole process of building these cars also heavily relies on oil and gas in the production process as well. So yes, we do need to continue talking about moving away from oil and gas and fossil fuels. But I think what we'll learn as we get into reading this is that's a really staggeringly difficult thing to do because of the way that our economy and our society has been organized. It's in absolutely everything. It's just surrounding you everywhere. Construction equipment is also all diesel, except in Norway, where they use oil profits to electrify the construction sector. That's a good point. And as we've seen in places like China, and we can talk about Chinese emissions whenever we talk about sustainable energy in the West. You inevitably have people saying, look at China's carbon emissions are way worse than ours, while they're making all of our stuff, making all these things that we use. This is something that comes up on this show a lot. And yes, there's a transition going on in China away from this form of energy. But even with this transition that they're nowhere near kind of completing, it's still extremely difficult to completely get away from, especially for developing countries. And this is part of the problem as well, where it's we've created this version of a modern developed society, and we encourage other countries and cultures to develop in the same way, which requires all this energy and which requires all these carbon emissions. And then we're okay, well, the global carbon emissions are leading us to this cliff edge of dangerous crisis. So now you got to knock it off. But it's we've tried to export this exact form of development all around the world. And now we're going to tell people in developing countries, oh no, you can't have all the things that we do, all the things that we've had for this entire generation. You can't have that. We can have it, but you can't have it because now it's too dangerous. And the way that becomes really tricky to talk about. Just talking about capitalism in this book, which says capitalism's underlying logic is one of endless accumulation, a push to accumulate more capital in the form of money that overrides all other considerations, which is worth pointing out as well when we talk about, when people want to defend capitalism and say it's just markets. Markets have existed throughout all of human history. That's all capitalism is. It's just markets. But no, it's not. It's not just markets. It's a specific form of economic organization, which the people at the very top of this food chain their brains have been completely reprogrammed by this insatiable need for, and again, the quote is endless accumulation. There's no point that someone can get to that has been fully consumed by this mentality where they're okay, I have enough. The whole underpinning ideology of this is endless accumulation, which is leading us to into this like terminal feedback loop, and is leading us to this major crisis, because we're not just organizing a society around like meeting people's needs, or, in the case of China, I think is an interesting example as well, using that economic mode of production in order to develop really, really rapidly, which they have done quite effectively. But also then you have a powerful state that's yanking the chain of the capitalist class and preventing them from getting to this point of like endless accumulation and having all the power over the state, what the capitalists in Western countries have in both Canada and the United States. Hania says the proportion of the world's work carried out by inanimate machinery rose from 10% in 1850 to 50% by 1900, reaching 90% by 1950, with the share of human labor falling commensurably. And that's what this whole first chapter is about the rise of the usage of these fossil fuels, coal and steam, and then eventually oil, and the way that has led to this process of automation that's continued. And that's continued into present day as well. And now we have AI as well, which is another kind of like form of machine or technology that's meant to be a form of automation. But what we've seen, and this is a part of capitalism as well, right, is that as this process of unlimited accumulation has continued, as this process of automation has continued, you haven't seen, like, coinciding with this rise in automation, a decrease in the worker exploitation, or like a ability for people to like live more meaningful lives and work less. On the contrary, it's been the exact opposite. This kind of worker exploitation is increasing along with this automation rather than decreasing. And again, that's part of the actual economic system that we're living in. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about endless accumulation, we're talking about the actual capitalists, the people that own the means of production and the factories and the machines and the oil conglomerates and all these other very powerful people. Of course, we don't have that same kind of driving need to endlessly accumulate. Like you're saying, for most people living in this society, it's about meeting needs. And yeah, for sure, I would be perfectly fine not having a car or burning oil to drive, but we have to, because we have to work to make money for the capitalists that own the industries that we work in, whatever it is. Just going back to the petrochemicals for plastic point briefly, I think Hania later on cites that 15% of all oil is used for things other than energy. It's a real takeaway from the first part of this book, how completely, and the entire book, how completely inescapable this is. And that like as much as we can and should talk about transitioning into sustainable energy, the idea that we can separate ourselves from oil and gas entirely is almost unthinkably impossible. I remember, years ago I got into this. There's this documentary called Collapse featuring this guy, Michael Rupert. And Rupert was kind of like a conspiracy crank. He became famous in the 90s because he was in the LAPD in the 80s. And in the 90s, he actively accused the CIA of dealing drugs in South Central Los Angeles. And eventually he had like a newsletter that was somewhat widely read. He was a conspiracy guy. And like, he's not a Marxist or anything like that. So you watch this documentary Collapse is just like this interview with this guy who's just kind of like a compelling and charismatic and kind of interesting fella. But so there's a lot of things that you can kind of discard in the things that he says, but he was really fixated on peak oil. And this is one thing that I remember learning about at that time, just the pervasive nature of this and the way it's completely in every single product that we use every single day. And we're completely surrounded and inundated by it at all times. Conspiracy guy, aka correct. Well, as usual, they're going to be more correct than not. I guess I should expand that ideology of endless accumulation is sort of imposed on us as a result of capitalism's adoption of it. I guess the point I'm making is similar to Amazon. I would like to buy locally more, but it's quite literally not financially viable for me to cut out online shopping completely, nor do I have the time. Yeah, and certainly you see people in our neighborhoods and communities that kind of adopt this endless accumulation mindset. The people that live in the suburbs and go to the big box stores and they got the McMansions and the SUV or the Ford F-150 or whatever, because that's part of the ideology that we live under, the actual ideology of capitalism, not necessarily just the economic machinery, but this way that like we're told and it's programmed into our brains from the time that we're literally babies, that the way that you achieve happiness and fulfillment and self-actualization in our society is by buying products. And you need to go to your job you need to sell your labor to get money, and then you can use that money to purchase things, stuff, products. And when you do, that makes you happy. That makes you feel like a real person. That's how you become self-actualized. This is like part of we're all programmed by this kind of thought. And we all feel it too, We all feel it. You get that thing that you wanted, the PS5 or the new car, or even smaller things, and you get that little feeling like, new guitar, whatever it is. And you get that feeling, it's satisfying. It feels good. You look at your nice little new thing, your new object, and it makes you feel good inside, So yes, I just wanted to make that distinction, because when you talk about this endless accumulation, we're talking about the very people at the very top of the food chain. But this is something that has been kind of like spread to the people that live in this system as well. And that involves a kind of flattening, right? I think, right? Buying Rob subs, exactly. People can subscribe and gift subs to this program, and it makes you feel good inside. But that's actually good. That actually is genuinely good. That's like a real thing. It does actually make you better as a person, and it improves your life. So that would be one case where actually I would push back ever so slightly. This is why the capitalist system is more than just greedy corpos, and mode production and train of thought captivates us all. Yes, I agree, but I think this is what I wanted to talk about. Is I think people that have really bought into this system, that really fully have given themselves over to it, there's this flattening where the person in the suburbs in the McMansion going to the strip mall in the Ford F-150 and are just, buy things, go buy stuff, continue consuming, consume. That's what makes me self-actualized. That's what makes me a human being. But then there's this flattening where they think they're the same as the oil CEO or the leader of these massive conglomerates. The CEO of ExxonMobil. Another note here, this is a quote from Andreas Malm, observes other sources of mechanical energy are pushed to the fringes. Capital expands in leaps and bounds, energized by fossil fuels. So we know that capitalism has been around for several hundred years, like the mode of production and the economic model, but was absolutely supercharged by fossil fuels and the way that process continued. And then the adoption of oil and gas, like we were talking about those hockey stick graphs, just sent it into the stratosphere. So that's kind of the main takeaway overall from this book. And this first chapter is really laying out this idea that capitalism and fossil fuels, and specifically oil and gas, are completely interconnected and dependent on one another. Graeber's Debt is a hefty read, but I think that explains this distinction very well. The vast majority operate by accumulation of debt rather than owning capital. Absolutely. And the guy in the lifted Ford F-150 knows plenty about that. Paying whatever ungodly monthly interest payments on those. Being wealthy does alienate you from the broader society. Exactly. Which is why I think appropriating people's wealth, as much as that gets framed as being this mean and authoritarian thing to do, we're actually doing these people a favor by doing that. We're saving them. We're rescuing them from this alienation that they've inflicted upon themselves. They're not happy. These people are not happy. People that have this level of wealth. That's why I liked Succession, because it really shows this. These are the people that at the absolute upper echelon of wealth and power, and they're all just miserable. They hate it. So we would be helping them. We would be helping them by taking away their wealth and just get, your new job is to go to the park a couple times a week and just pick up trash, and you're going to have an apartment, and you're going to be okay. These people would be, overall, they might not like it at first, but eventually they would be fine with it. Another quote here: an easy way to cheapen energy is to avoid paying the full costs of its production through, for example, utilizing underpaid labor or dumping toxic waste products into the environment. For this reason, the places where energy is extracted and produced tend to become sites of deep social and ecological degradation. Plenty of examples of that in both America and around the world. But we're, again, to do it for a really modern 2026 analogy, we're seeing the same thing with the creation of these data centers and, poisoning these local communities. But poisoning local communities and destroying infrastructure and giving people cancer, that's a long capitalist tradition. So a lot of this first chapter it focuses on, the role of coal, because that for a long time was the primary fossil fuel that was powering everything. And Hania notes as well that the adoption of coal, in the UK specifically, led to an explosion of child labor, because you need small child's bodies to get into these dangerous mines. There's another thing, another point here, which I think is worth thinking about: the way that coal and coke, which is like a coal byproduct, and the steam engine, and the adoption of these technologies really helped supercharge British imperialism. So that's another way that these things are completely linked and they're completely inseparable. The continued and expanded use of these fossil fuels allowed the British to expand throughout the world and expand their colonialist and imperialist practices. So the way that like oil and gas is really tied up in imperialism and colonialism, but also weapons manufacturing, and the way this has been like these two things really have allowed a lot of these powerful countries, first in the British Empire and then later in the American Empire, to dominate the world through the imperialism by oil and gas manufacturing and by weapons manufacturing. Like what everything the British East India Company was doing is a good example of that. They're using this new fossil fuel technology and steam technology to get around the world a lot quicker, and then they're using their edge that they have in weapons manufacturing to completely dominate and bend a lot of these societies around the world to their will and force them into this this really unfair and exploitative relationship. I was struck by the observation that despite the peak of coal dominance in the world market happening in the 1880s, the overall use of coal increased fourfold since then. It really puts into perspective how energy dependence is simply ever increasing. Yeah, that is a good point. As much as we think about that as being on the decline, and yeah, like I mentioned earlier, like we're exporting our kind of lifestyle and our way of life around the world, and then other countries that are developing are needing to use this technology and these kind of fossil fuels, and we know that it's harmful. We know it's like contributing to this like major crisis, but it becomes difficult to talk about because this is fueling the development of a lot of these other societies. Yeah, also explore how militarism and the global drive to war propelled oil to the center of U.S. state power and also helped encourage the early international expansion of U.S. oil firms beginning in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think this is an important thing about why we're talking about this book right now. I think it's good to talk about to understand, the nature of our economic model and really fully understand the way that oil and gas is completely enmeshed in that. But, two countries, specifically for right at this exact moment, two countries that really loom large in the early chapters of this book are Iran and Venezuela. And, this is in over a century ago that a lot of this, the early stages of this was taking place. And here we are today. And who are the first countries that Trump's going after in this new administration is Venezuela and Iran. And as we'll talk about, though, and this is a really interesting aspect of this book and these first couple of chapters, we can think about the United States going into Iraq or Iran or Venezuela and the stuff that Trump says about we need to take the oil. We're seizing the oil, when it's actually not really an accurate way of talking about it. And another thing Trump says on the contrary to that is like, we don't need the oil. We've got enough oil. And that is actually true. And that going into these nations isn't about taking their oil, because one big problem that these massive oil companies have, especially in the early stages of this book, is the overproduction and the abundance of this resource. We think about it as a finite resource, and we need to go and overthrow governments to take their oil because we don't have enough. We actually do. That's a big problem with these oil companies we're having. There's actually too much, and we keep discovering new vast oil fields, and it's actually a big problem for us here. There's a crisis of overproduction. So going into all these different countries like Venezuela and Iraq and Iran isn't about taking their oil. It's about controlling and dominating the market, because that's how they get their profits. Because if there's actually the amount of oil that exists was actually being used like that, their profits would be significantly lower. They want to control and dominate all these markets. And this is exactly why the United States and previous to that, Britain and any of these other colonialist countries have gone into and attempted to destroy and overthrow any country that tries to nationalize their resources, oil especially, but we've seen it with other resources as well. This is a threat to the profits of these big conglomerates. That's why they do it. And then they're not trying to steal their oil. They're not trying to take it. They're trying to control completely the global market. That's why they do it. So this is a direct quote from this book, and this gets into in the first couple of chapters. Hania says, one of the challenges in writing about oil is that so much of its history has been determined by secret gatherings of powerful people behind closed doors. And there's a number of examples in these first couple of chapters about some of these secret gatherings by immensely powerful people. And again, I'm reminded of the quote from Michael Parenti talking about conspiracy theories. And what is a conspiracy theory? And this idea that people that try to debunk this kind of thing about conspiracy or whatever it is, and they say, oh, what, you think... It's always very funny when Parenti talks about this. You think people just get together in rooms, the smoke-filled room, which has become like a trope. You think people just get together in rooms? And it's like, yeah, they get together in rooms. They absolutely do that. Very powerful people. They get together in rooms and they discuss these things and they come to these agreements and go to great lengths to hide the things that they are discussing and the things that they are agreeing on. Yeah, and of course, class interest keeps them aligned between meetings too. But they are indeed meeting together in rooms and talking about things and dividing up the world and figuring this shit out. Golf courses too. Yeah, I mean, it's just, maybe it's not necessarily a room. It could be a golf course as well. But I just think that's a funny thing when people try to get this idea. Oh, you believe this like Illuminati? They're all getting together in these places and discussing these things. Yeah, of course, there's ridiculous angles to that we can point at. That we think it's like the stonecutters where they're all in robes and doing weird fucking rituals and stuff. Even though if you're asking me, I do think that stuff goes on as well. To be clear, I do think there's weird robes and rituals and fucked up shit going on. Perhaps the Epstein stuff is kind of a little glimpse into that, which is why it's loomed so large over our discourse. But overall, it's like it doesn't need to be that deep, you know? Yes, they're getting together in rooms. And there's numerous examples just in these early chapters about some of these clandestine secret meetings between immensely powerful people, which have had huge, far-reaching consequences. And, we've talked about the role as well, that like I think the people that you might describe as conspiracy theorists actually obscure a lot of this stuff because they sound so wacky. You believe this conspiracy where they hold meetings in rooms with long tables that are recorded for posterity, then brag about what they said and did in said rooms? You're a nut. Well, I think that's one thing that's in this book, though, is like, yes, that's what's going on in boardrooms all the time. But there are meetings as well where they really made big efforts to avoid revealing or discussing the things that they did agree on, including coming up with like big agreements and then not even signing them and then like not even revealing what was discussed in any of these situations like years later. As soon as you see how many board certain people sit on, it seems ridiculous to think anything else. Many of the big capitalists are on like 50 boards for sure. And like all of these people are all going to the same private schools. They're all part of these same like weird secret societies. And there's just basically this like machine that just churns these people out. Okay, here's another interesting point here that is very relevant to everything that's been going on today as well for years, is talking about like OPEC and the way, like in the 70s, there was these oil embargoes, which caused massive price spikes. And OPEC at that time were cast as like villains for these embargoes. But one thing that became clear in that era is that these U.S. oil companies benefited massively from this crisis. So as much as these very people or people in the United States government might have framed OPEC as being villains for engaging in these oil embargoes, all of these U.S. firms made absolute killing in this process of this crisis, which you can see echoes of in current situations that are ongoing right at this very moment. And a lot of this as well, of what was going on in the 70s, directly fed into the resurgence of this new right in America, and neoliberalism and market liberalization and deregulation and Reagan and Thatcher. Like a lot of what was going on in the 70s directly contributed to the rise of that new kind of like political or resurgent political ideology that ended up completely just dominating Western societies. It led to the creation of the petrodollar as well. It made the U.S. the dollar, the global reserve currency, and it props up all of these Gulf monarchies and slave states, basically. These Gulf monarchies where there's a powerful ruling class and the society is completely run by extremely poor or outright enslaved, racialized peoples in these Gulf states. Another thing going on as well is in this early chapter, this first chapter, which is called Approaching Oil. Another thing that Hania takes pains to point out is the way that like these big oil companies today are no longer climate deniers. You know, they played a large role in obscuring climate science and funding junk science and preventing us from making any meaningful changes to our society as a result to in a way to protect their profits. But these companies are no longer climate deniers. Now all these companies are investing in, they're talking about net zero. They're talking about, our personal consumption choices and what we can all do to mitigate this problem and mitigate our carbon emissions. So that's the shift that's happened over the last 10, 15 years, is that now all of these companies, you can go on YouTube and you can find all the commercials for like Shell or Exxon talking about green energy and sustainability and net zero and carbon capture and all this stuff. Yeah, maybe they dropped their net zero pledges this year because now it's the Trump administration said that it's woke, so they no longer even have to pretend. But that was, I think, what was going on through a lot of like the 2010s as the climate crisis and our obsession and addiction to fossil fuels was really becoming like on the forefront of our discourse. So this concludes basically with this idea. It says, with oil so deeply interlaced with capitalism and the making of global power over the last century, any real hope of addressing the climate emergency must be coupled with a politics of deep-rooted system change. And I think that's always going to be the inescapable conclusion to any of this stuff. If we want to meaningfully avert the possible disaster on the horizon, the absolute calamitous disaster on the horizon, it involves completely fundamentally changing and restructuring our entire society. It's not something that's going to happen on an incremental basis. It's not going to happen from like voting for the Trudeaus and Obamas and Bidens and Kamala Harrises of the world, who are going to talk about the seriousness of it, that are going to make these pledges, that are going to go, I'm going to go back into the Paris agreements, right? That was the whole thing, right? Like Trump comes in and the first Trump administration says, we're getting out of the Paris agreement. It's been a disaster. It's a terrible deal. And then Biden gets elected, like, we're going to go back in the Paris agreement, Jack. Well, these agreements mean nothing. We've made all kinds of agreements. We've had all kinds of like meetings and agreements and pledges to, limit carbon emissions to X amount or to do this or that. None of it has actually happened. All of these like green energy and sustainability conferences is all just like complete a way for us to kind of feel better about the situation while doing and changing nothing. In order to actually meaningfully confront this, it means completely, fundamentally reorganizing and restructuring everything about our society and our economy. Yeah, and that often comes up when we talk about China. And yet China's a huge carbon emitter, and we've talked about the reasons for why that is. But one thing that we can talk about, and they're very deeply implicated in the entire global economy and the global system that runs on oil and gas. We can acknowledge that. We can also say, though, in terms of at the very least, their pledges to meet certain targets about emissions or sustainability or renewable energy, they are actually like hitting these targets. And they've actually been quite honest about like our emissions are actually going to continue to rise up to this point, and then they're going to go down because they're like, there's an actual serious plan that's being put in place to go on over decades, which is not something that we can do in our Western liberal democracies, as I've talked about before, because we can't plan for 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 20 or 50 years from now. We can only plan on in a quarter by quarter by quarter, election cycle by election cycle. So this gets into the next chapter of Crude Capitalism, Chapter 2, Petropower, the rise of the U.S. oil industry. And again, I was just struck by this because it says in 1859, when Colonel Drake drilled the first successful American oil well in the small town of Titusville, Pennsylvania. Interesting, too, how Pennsylvania all these years later is that the whole thing about Biden and the Democratic Party and fracking. And we're going to ban fracking, Jack. But then it's like, if we do that, we're going to lose Pennsylvania because this is still such a vital industry all these years later. So 1859, when Colonel Drake drilled the first successful American oil well in the small town of Titusville, Pennsylvania. I was just struck by that because it's like, it's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. We grow up in this system and you think it's always been this way. But it just shows how, like, quite recently, in the grand scheme of history, this commodity just did not even exist at all. And we've gone from 1859 to current day, where it's just completely inundated every aspect of our society. So as all these oil wells were popping up in America, one thing that these like major players in the industry were discovering was that it was really difficult to control. There was just anybody could stake a claim in some of this land and start trying to drill and create an oil well. And it was leading already very early into this crisis of overproduction that I mentioned earlier. And this was Standard Oil, which is the first major oil conglomerate to rise up, which was Rockefeller's company. This is what led Rockefeller to become the richest person in the world. And what they realized they needed to do was something called vertical integration, where they controlled all levels of production, from extraction to transport to refinery, sale, and they want every single aspect of that to be fully under their control. This gets into like the men in rooms thing. They created what was called the Standard Oil Trust, which, quote, made no agreements, signed no contracts, kept no books. It had no legal existence. It was a force powerful as gravitation and as intangible. You could argue its existence from its effects, but you could never prove it. You could no more grasp it than you could an eel. This was what the creation of the Standard Oil Trust. And just to explain that a little bit more, Standard Oil Trust was organized by Rockefeller in 1882. It was a dominant monopoly controlling roughly 90% of all of U.S. oil refining and transportation by the late 1880s. So it was utilizing a trust agreement to merge 40 different corporations and centralized industry control. And like I said, there was no real evidence of this existing. It was purely done like in these smoky rooms, and this agreement that created this vast monopoly for Standard Oil. And it says Standard's corporate structure would set the template for the global oil industry to the present day. From this moment on, all leading oil companies would strive to become vertically integrated, creating intricate networks of subsidiaries engaged in extraction, transportation, refining, and marketing that were spread across the globe. And I guess I would argue, too, that it's not just the template for the global oil industry, but for all of corporate America, because we've seen a number of non-oil and gas companies engaged throughout the world in this exact same way. That was my kind of takeaway from this kind of section here, is that it became standard operating procedure for modern capitalism. Because like this trust was so powerful, this monopoly was so powerful, it was really, really resistant to state regulation. And with the more power that they had, the more ability they had to wield this power and to shield themselves from any kind of like, regulation or, antitrust stuff. And this is very interesting too, because then in 1911, Standard Oil does get broken up for violating antitrust laws. There's a ruling that comes in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1911 that forces Standard Oil and the Standard Oil Trust, which technically didn't exist but did, and they break it up into several different companies for violating these antitrust laws. And again, like, this is something we see over and over and over again in capitalism, where the people that are at the top of this food chain, even when it seems like they're being punished, actually benefit from it. Like you talked about OPEC and the oil crisis in the 70s and how all these oil companies benefited from that. And this case was the same thing. Standard Oil gets broken up into all these different companies. And as a result, Rockefeller becomes vastly more wealthy. He becomes the richest man in the world as a result of this Supreme Court ruling, which is designed to, limit Standard Oil's ability to have this monopoly. And Rockefeller benefits from all these companies getting broken up. And Standard Oil gets turned into Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Standard Oil of Indiana, which eventually merges with BP. And where did BP get its start? Iran. Almost like the courts was just another arm of capital. I want to say that it wasn't always this way to this extent. I do think there was elements of the U.S. government and people in there that really did attempt to rein in the power of these corporations, but they lost. I think that's the takeaway. They lost. And eventually it's just been completely consumed. And that's fascism, right? When capital and the ultra wealthy and powerful have completely consumed the state, and then the state becomes just a vehicle to funnel profits to the people that are actually the ruling class, with zero ability to like rein these people in or regulate them in any way. So these four large firms were established as independent firms at a time when commercial use of the internal combustion engine was growing rapidly. Because this is 1911 when these companies are created, right as car culture is being invented in the United States. They were thus strategically positioned along with a handful of other major vertically integrated U.S. firms such as Gulf Oil and Texaco at the epicenter of the very birth of a new petroleum-fueled world market. And the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 vastly strengthened the power of these large integrated U.S. firms. That's another common thing that keeps coming up. I mentioned the hockey stick graphs at the beginning of this talk. about the post-war period, and you see every time there's a major crisis or there's a major world war, the US specifically, but all of these oil and gas firms come away from that vastly more powerful than they were previously. As soon as the automobile becomes widely adopted, how do the cities respond? We're getting rid of public transit. We're getting rid of rail. We're not building any kind of rail or transit or anything like that. We're going to build a vast network of interconnected highways that people are going to drive automobiles on. Wait a second, I'm starting to think that the war in Iran might have something to do with oil. Yes, I believe so. It all has to do with oil. But as we've talked about, it's not just about taking Iran's oil to use it. It's about controlling and dominating the global market for this substance. And it's about managing a crisis of overproduction. There's too much oil. That's the takeaway from a lot of this book here. There's too much. And if they can control the global market, they control how much oil is being extracted at any given time. And that's how they can maximize their own profits. Yeah, and again, that's why when a place like Iran or Venezuela or any other country nationalizes their resources like this, that's why it's such a big problem for the United States State Department, because that disrupts the ability of these Western conglomerates to totally dominate the global market. It's not about like, oh, they're taking the oil and we want the oil. What they want is control. What they want is control, full control over the global market and every single aspect of production. So yeah, talking about the way that this is supercharged by these world wars. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 vastly strengthened the power of these large integrated U.S. firms. In 1914, this is a crazy stat. In 1914, the British military had only 823 cars and 15 motorcycles. By the end of the war, it had 23,000 cars, 63,000 trucks, and 34,000 motorcycles. So like the extent to which this was just like completely supercharged by the war. And again, the power of the United States and the power of these US-based oil conglomerates drastically, exponentially increased during this period. Not just like selling oil to these countries, which required oil during the war, but also becoming a economic hub of the world, becoming the banking system for the entire world. That's, you see the rise of Wall Street. They're like paying for these allied debts. And this is how, the U.S. became the global banker during this period as well. So all of this led Britain's Lord Curzon to quip famously that the Allied forces had, quote, floated to victory on a wave of oil. But what Curzon declined to mention is that this oil was overwhelmingly American. Remarkably, around 80% of all the oil used by Allied forces during the First World War came from the U.S. From this point onwards, militarism will become a principal driver of oil consumption. Indeed, today, as we know, the largest single institutional consumer of oil on the planet, and thus the largest institutional source of carbon emissions, is the U.S. military. So again, that gets into like, why are we going into Iran or Iraq? To take their oil? Why are we doing this or that? Well, yes, we don't want to take their oil. We do want these companies to control and dominate the global market, but also it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a totally self-fulfilling prophecy because the more war there is, the American oil companies are providing the oil, the fossil fuels to fuel that, as well as the weapons manufacturing firms and all this. It's America's like central economic driver is war. So they'll always find reasons to go into this or that country throughout the Cold War. It was to fight communism. Obviously, resource extraction and monopolization had a lot to do with that. But there's always going to be a reason, whatever the reason is, human rights or, women's rights or whatever it is that we use to justify these wars. It's because it's a central driver of the entire United States economy. They will never not be going to wars. That's how they became the world's most wealthy, country and empire. So this is really interesting too. Cause I talked about that Supreme Court ruling that was 1911. That broke up Standard Oil, okay? 1911. Only a few years later, 1917, as this war is going on, which the U.S. is profiting from immensely, but in 1917, just before the U.S. joined the war, a government advisory board was formed that brought together the leaders of the 6 largest U.S. oil companies. This National Petroleum War Service Committee, the NPWSC, was headed by the chair of SONJ, Alfred Bedford, and was given a direct role in government decision-making, including the ability to set national oil production levels and refinery outputs. So I found that really interesting as well, because you have the government actually come in, the United States government in 1911, and come out with this ruling that breaks up Standard Oil and tries to enforce these antitrust laws. Just 5-6 years later, it's the government themselves that's creating a new massive oil monopoly that has immense amount of power and leverage over the United States government itself. So you see the process of like even these feeble efforts to try and control and regulate this industry, which benefited Rockefeller and benefited these wealthy people anyways, even if their monopolies were being broken up. Just a few years later, you have the United States government basically creating a new monopoly of all these private interests that can have this immense amount of ability to set actual policy about oil and gas and energy. Yeah, and this is crazy. Following this, a range of hugely consequential tax breaks and financial subsidies for U.S. oil firms were also introduced at this time that went far beyond those provided to any other industry. And if you live in Canada, although this is very relevant as well. The most astonishing of these was the 1918 Oil Depletion Allowance, a deduction from taxable income that enabled oil producers to offset the depletion of their oil mine in a manner that resembled capital depreciation. Over the next decade, this tax break would evolve into a 27.5% annual deduction on the gross income from oil production, a figure that was arbitrarily chosen to make it, quote, appear as though it was scientifically arrived at, according to the Texan senator who supported the law in 1926. A crucial detail of this tax regulation was that the total amount taken for depletion was unlimited over the life of the mine. As a result, the overall subsidy received by the oil company could end up being many times the original cost of investment. So again, you see this very short length of time between the U.S. government making this kind of feeble effort to regulate and rein in these incredibly powerful oil monopolies, to bringing them together in the war period to kind of create a new monopoly, and then creating this situation where the United States government basically becomes a guarantor or a bank for these private corporations. So if you're a private corporation and you're going to start an oil refinery, the entire costs of that are being covered by the United States government later. So what is that the strong example of? Publicly subsidized, privately profitable. It's not just the lyrics in a popular propaganda song. It's completely publicly subsidized. There's no risk involved whatsoever for these massive oil companies and these vastly powerful industries. Everything is completely guaranteed by the United States government. So any investment you're going to make is going to be paid back many times over by the actual U.S. government. And so you think of this idea of like domestic oil production, is this domestic oil production, what is it being used for? Is it being used to like benefit the actual people that live in these communities? Is it providing their energy? Is it, was it being used for? No, it's the actual people that are financing the extraction of this resource so it can be privately sold, and the powerful CEOs and shareholders of these industries can extract vast profits from it. So it's publicly subsidized and it's privately profitable. Many such cases as well. This is going to get into a later chapter as well, but there's stuff about Baku and the Soviet Union, which was a massive source of oil extraction as well, and was basically the first OPEC. But it says the Soviet Union, which was the third largest area of world oil production through the 1920s. The oil sector was controlled by the new Bolshevik government. And yeah, that was the question that I had. And I think the later chapters, or I think even the next chapter is going to get into this idea. But prior to the Russian Revolution, who was controlling the oil sector in Russia? Who lost money when the revolution happened? Who lost power and influence when the revolution happened? And how did that factor into the whole next 80 years of the Cold War and, attacks on the Soviet Union, leading to the Soviet Union being dismantled? Russia is a really interesting angle to this story because the oil industry, obviously the oil and gas industry in post-Soviet Russia has played a massive role as well. And all of the entire oligarchic ruling class of Russia right now are all deeply tied into the oil and gas industry, including Putin. As a director of SONJ would note in 1917, in protecting our foreign investments, we protect ourselves and our friends by controlling a greater percentage of the foreign business which comes directly into competition with U.S. products. By owning it, we can influence its activity at times when production is too great or too small in America and maintain more regular conditions. So this is what these extremely powerful oil giants in 1917 were realizing is we can't just control and monopolize and dominate the domestic United States oil and gas industry. We need to completely dominate the entire global industry as well, because that's the only way, controlling all these global markets, that's the way we can really control this resource, have full control over it and every aspect of its extraction and refinement, and that's how we're going to maximize profits for ourselves. So the first target of U.S. international oil expansion was Latin America, where U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing proclaimed in 1918 that, quote, no oil properties in the neighborhood of the Panama Canal should be owned by other than Americans. So again, you see this attitude about U.S. and Latin America, which we sometimes call the Monroe Doctrine. But that's how they've always viewed Latin America. And it's Biden talks about this, Trump talks about this, it's our backyard. That's our backyard, Jack. They've always viewed all the resources, regardless of what the borders are, they've always viewed all the resources in Latin America or anywhere south of the United States, including Mexico, as their own. And this is why Venezuela, there's still a conflict with Venezuela for exactly that reason. Because Mexico and Venezuela is where American oil expansionism really took hold in the decade after the First World War. The Venezuelan state served as a dependable U.S. ally to both the U.S. and European oil firms. Although the country had a history of worker militancy, this is fascinating too, because it has this history of worker militancy. It had been ruled since 1908 by the autocratic general Juan Vicente Gomez, who allowed oil companies to drill for oil without paying taxes or royalties. Gomez would either sell concessions directly to oil firms or pass them on to close allies who would then market them to foreign companies, helping him to cultivate a layer of support among Venezuelan elites that allowed his reign to last in one form or another until 1935. And by the time that time came, he was by far the wealthiest person in Latin America, the richest man in Latin America. And an interesting thing about this as well that I realized, because they talked about this history of worker militancy in Venezuela, and one thing that was going on was that these US-based and some European oil companies that were working in Venezuela and extracting resources in Venezuela did not refine it in the product in Venezuela. They created these massive refineries in the Caribbean, in Honduras is one place, and elsewhere. And so they would extract the oil in Venezuela. They would ship the oil into the Caribbean where these refineries were, where the workers there were going to give them less trouble because you wouldn't be dealing with any pesky militant Venezuelan workers who were going to start getting ideas about what their role in this supply chain or how their level of exploitation that was going on. So the Caribbean became a big hub here as well, because they could extract the oil from Venezuela, refine it in the Caribbean, and then ship it up to the United States without having to transport it via pipelines or that kind of infrastructure. So another thing that happened after World War I, we're talking about, we just talked about Venezuela and Latin America, but also the U.S. using their oil supply as leverage to get into these foreign markets after World War I in Europe, because they financed the Allied powers and they wanted a cut of the profits. And you saw efforts on the part of the British, you saw efforts on the part of the French to try and freeze these American companies out of their colonial holdings and to ensure, the pound or the franc were still being used as this currency in these places. And there were efforts to keep these American firms out of these regions, but America strong-armed their way in there. They made this argument: we finance the Allied powers, we want a cut of these profits. They used their supply as leverage to get into these foreign markets. So they made a ruling that these foreign companies couldn't access U.S. oil if they were going to discriminate against U.S. firms in their territories. So they put huge pressure on the British government and the French government because they really relied on this Western market, the American market, and they had to make these concessions to allow American firms to come into their holdings, including like what was, Iran and Iraq and some of these places. And so the United States government used this resource as a way to like muscle their way into these foreign markets, which I also found interesting because like when any other country around the world tries to use their domestic oil reserves to start making all kinds of demands, that's when they get attacked, they get overthrown, they get bombed, they get sanctioned, they get embargoed. But you see, America did exactly that. And that's how it became so powerful, was by using the leverage of their domestic market to strong arm themselves into these foreign markets that they wanted access to. Because again, these companies, they wanted control over the whole world. They weren't satisfied with just controlling the American market. They wanted full control over the entire global market. We're getting into chapter 3, which is the Middle East and the Seven Sisters, which is it's interesting because we think about the Middle East as the oil epicenter, but really it was the United States that was the oil epicenter. For a long time, Iran was the only Middle Eastern country that was meaningfully producing oil. And then that eventually changed a lot in that post-war period. So in Iraq, they formed something called the IPC, which was a crucial milestone. Through it, SONJ and SONY, the initial majority shareholders in the Near East Development Corporation, gained their first permanent foothold in the Middle East. Iraq's prospective oil reserves were believed to be enormous, and IPC had managed to capture an extraordinarily favorable concession from the Iraqi government: rights to all oil over the entire territory of the country for the next 75 years, except for a small area near the town of Basra in the south, as well as exclusive marketing rights for petroleum inside Iraq. And this is outrageous. This concession was won through negotiations with the government of the Iraqi monarch, King Faisal I, a man who had held no previous connections to Iraq, but who had been installed by Britain as ruler in 1921 following the bloody suppression by the British Air Force of a mass nationwide revolt. So, right, this is the British. There's a mass nationwide revolt in the early 20s. It gets ruthlessly crushed by the British and the British Air Force. They install a king in Iraq who has no actual connection to Iraq. And then they negotiate with this king who gives them a hugely profitable and exploitative control over their vast oil reserves. Yeah, you're negotiating with the guy on your side that you put in place after crushing a massive rebellion. Yes, and it does sound familiar. And that's, I think, one thing that continues occurring to me reading through this, how familiar all of this seems. And all these places where this is going on, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, and the way that we talk about, the need to attack and dominate these countries because of like terrorism or human rights, or they hate our freedoms or whatever it is. And it's just as clear as day why these countries are targeted for this reason. But that's a crazy story, the thing about King Faisal. So of course the IPC, which I believe is the Iraq Petroleum Company, completely screws over the actual Iraqis that live there, obviously. And similar to Standard Oil, it was the same kind of vertical integration and this full control, which I said it became kind of standard operating procedure for the entire oil and gas industry and basically global capitalism, this kind of vertical integration where they control all aspects of production in this way. And this is a point we've continually come back to this as well. The real significance of IPC lay not so much in what it meant for the increased production of oil, but rather the power it gave member firms to restrict production. This is something that I keep coming back to. This idea, we went into Iraq to take their oil. We're going to Iran to take their oil. There's literally too much oil. That was the big problem facing these oil companies in this era. There's too much oil that we know what to do with. We need to control and dominate these places so we can restrict production, not increase, so we can restrict the production of it. And in Iraq, for example, this is how they were able to do this. And these are places too where they have there's supposed to be royalties being paid, even if the royalties are completely unfair, but there's supposed to be royalties being paid that actually go to support the people. Bonus points if you can get your puppets to take out billions in IMF loans as well. For sure. It's just like every aspect of it is just a complete fucking scam. So this is how they were able to do that, restrict production in this way. In Iraq, for example, IPC dragged its feet on exploration and production, restricting production to only 0.5% of the country's total area, despite the fact it controlled most of the country's oil fields. In neighboring Syria, another place where we got to go into Syria because of all these reasons, because of the bad guy that's in charge, or Libya as well, or any of these places. In neighboring Syria, the company deliberately, again, this is one of these things that just had me shaking my head reading it. In neighboring Syria, the company deliberately drilled shallow wells in areas where it was confident that no oil would be found, to create a pretense that it was complying with the terms of concession agreements. So it's like you make deals with these places, and we're going to have these wells, and we're going to, by extracting this resource, that's going to be a benefit to the people like in these countries. And they're going to above and beyond to try and restrict production, including drilling in places where they know full well that there is no oil. So they can say to the actual people that are there, these like puppet governments that are there, look, we're there, we're drilling, we're doing it, we're fulfilling the obligations that we've made here, but they're deliberately drilling in places where they know there's no oil, precisely because they're trying to control and restrict the production. Alongside these mechanisms, IPC stalled the development of oil field infrastructure, delayed the building of oil pipelines, and brought up concessions in order to take potential oil supplies off the market. Actions such as these were to continue throughout the 1950s and 60s, much to the chagrin of local governments eager to maximize oil production and thus royalties. So again, this is what has led to this process of attempted resource nationalization. Like Iraq eventually went through this process of nationalizing their oil reserves for this reason. It was in reaction to this and this kind of practices, not unbridled extraction. They weren't saying like all these companies are extracting everything and they're taking all the wealth and they're polluting and they're doing this and that. They were nationalizing their resources in response to underproduction and the fact that production was being deliberately restricted. They were like, we have so much oil, we want to nationalize so we can actually drill the oil, and then we're going to get royalties by selling the oil and actually like make money. But again, this process was not put in place so the local populations could make money. The process was in place so these extremely powerful oil interests would make money. And that gets into Iran and Venezuela as well, who have also made efforts over the years to nationalize oil production, and in doing so have become targets for military activity and sanctions and blockades and all this stuff. So I think that's the main takeaway, though, is that like the reason these countries are targeted is not so we can take their oil. We got a lot of oil, as Trump has talked about. We don't need Iran's oil. We don't need it. There's lots of oil in America. There's a lot of oil in Canada as well. They're not doing it so they can take the oil. They're doing it so they can completely, fully control and dominate the global market. So those are all my notes for the first 3 chapters of Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market. I think an effective thing oil companies have done is propagandizing workers to tie up their identity with working in the oil industry. Yeah, I mean, being in Alberta, that's been a hugely successful project there, and I'm sure in a lot of these other oil producing regions. And as we've talked about, that's the amazing thing about it, is that like, as much as there's been this like effort to suggest that anyone that's trying to go after the oil industry or their profits is somehow against these workers, no one exploits these oil workers more than these oil companies. And these workers end up having this like weird, like, we know the actual idea of Stockholm syndrome is like fake, but that is kind of what happens. These workers it becomes such a part of their identity. They completely believe all this idea that their very identities are being attacked by these dangerous radicals and the NDP or whoever it is. The actual workers in this industry are exploited by these companies, not by the government. And that's why when we talk about, a just transition or expanding into more sustainable energy, a big part of that is protecting these workers and ensuring these workers are not being screwed over. No one wants that. No one wants these oil workers to be screwed over. What we want is to actually help these workers to get out from under the boot of this industry that exploits them in this way. Yeah, we've talked about that a lot, Jay, about how it falls into this trap where it's like we can't win on an anti-oil message, so we've got to just like be the nice oil people, and then we've seen repeatedly how much of a losing strategy that is. And there's genuine class collaboration in the North American oil industry. They get paid quite well, even if they're being exploited in a technical sense. Yeah, I mean that's true. But I think if you look at like the jobs, the availability of jobs, right, which has been restricted more and more and more. So yes, the people that are maybe fortunate enough to actually like get these jobs can do quite well, even though they're not doing anywhere near as well as the people at the top of the ladder. But if your job is so precarious that it can be taken away like that and restricted, like that's where that exploitation come in. Absolutely, the people that do work in the industry can do very well from that. But again, I talked about the kind of flattening between the ultra powerful and just the kind of like middle class, upper middle class, and the way that they start to think of themselves as being on the same level when really there's no comparison to be made whatsoever. The messaging about the Iran war, it says the Trump administration's motive for the Iran war is to grab oil to sell at premiums to oil-dependent countries in the future, then control the transition to green energy. The left acts like the Trump admin has no motive or endgame, where they claim the motive is Israel's war, Epstein's war. And like I'm not doubting like that there is a kind of like power element about controlling resources. As again, and that's why Iran's been targeted all these years. But I also don't think it's mutually exclusive. I'm not willing to say like, oh, Israel's security concerns had nothing to do with this, because as much as the United States wants to control global oil production, and Iran is a big piece of that puzzle. There's a reason that no previous administration has tried to launch a war with Iran, precisely because it's so fucking basically impossible. As they've found out the hard way by doing this. But again, I think that was the thing that I pointed out earlier, which is that in the same way that all the price shocks of the 1970 oil crisis was a huge benefit and a huge source of profit for these oil conglomerates at that time, we're seeing the same thing right now. So even if we might say, oh, Trump is causing the gas prices to go up, people are going to be so mad. Yeah, they probably will. But the people that won't be mad are the oil companies. Just like always, they're going to benefit from this. Just as the rich and powerful always benefit from every major crisis that happens. This is no different.